Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week, Bridge and I are tackling management versus leadership. Yes, there are overlaps, but what are the differences? When do they work well together in organisations? And when can we distinctly sniff that there is one without the other? Join us to hear more in Being the Difference, management versus leadership. Well, hello, and here we are again. And you're still on mute.
Hiya.
2 in a row. I think we should just leave them in because it's like I do like the fact that you're so consistent in your art form.
Yeah, I've been muting it so that when you're doing the intro that I'm not like snorting and snuffling like a sort of banter in the background. But then I forget to turn it back on again.
So, the distinct difference between management and leadership, or the distinct difference between being on the snorting badger in the background. I love that. I'm not quite sure if I can make a segue out of both of those, but I did say before we came online and we managed to press record, and yet this new trick you have, which is let's just stay on mute, happened. We did say that we ought to try and create some structure.
Yes.
That would be a first, wouldn't it?
It will be a first. I don't know how long it will last, but a sort of structural introduction is, I think, going to be a new experience for everyone.
Yeah, so I have got notes in front of me. I don't want it to come across as like, oh, and here's the notes I made earlier, but it might have to be like that just to help us into it. So let's give this a go and see what actually happens, right? So I tried to do this with some level of structure. So we were talking last week about mindset for resilience and flexibility. So I have actually gone down this route to try to create show what the differences are between leadership and management, or management and leadership, whichever way around we want to do it, both in terms of skills. But I'm going to start with mindset because I think that we can learn skills, but I also want us hopefully to talk about what's the mindset that we have to learn or we have to be practicing as well for these two things. Right, so rather than actually procrastinating any further, because I don't really want to do this bit,
Come on, you can do it, Bobby.
I'll make a start. Okay, so the things I had down for a management mindset are operational focus, risk aversion, and short-term thinking. So let's just go through those. So the operational focus is very much about how do we get shit done? How do we do things around here? How are we doing them efficiently and effectively? So it's very much action oriented. Something has to happen. The risk aversion one was about making sure that you've got good plans, good project plans for everything, so that you've got contingencies and you've thought about potential issues. You can tell I'm reading notes from this because this isn't necessarily how I've ever gone about managing, but thankfully I've had very good managers who have been able to do that. So that's 2. The third one, short-term thinking. So this is such a distinction for me about what you want managers to be doing is to having what the long-term future actually looks like, but they're making it into bite-sized chunks. It's the how do you eat the elephant, one bite at a time, so that you want a manager to be actually drawing it all the way back in and going, if we've got this goal target over there, what have we done today to head towards that? What have we done this week? What have we done this month? What have we done this quarter? So that goes back to the planning element, but it's much more of the short-term thinking and making sure that deadlines are being met, etc., etc., to achieve broader goals.
And Seth Godin, I think, equates it to a glacier. So that, that a glacier can chomp its way through a valley or create a valley, and it just keeps going. Yeah. And I've always heard in management equated to maintenance of status quo. Yeah. So this is what we have to do. This is our daily grind. That's not sounds sort of a little bit pejorative. It's not meant in that way, but it is the daily grind of the glacier going through in a direction. Whereas the leader is about dealing with change.
Stop.
Sorry.
How dare you break into my structured way of doing
Okay,
things.
Sorry, yes.
I knew you would not be able to stop yourself.
Structure is not
my thank you for the segue and trying to, wade in on something that you told me that I had to do. But there we go. So yes, but you are absolutely right. The glacier The manager is about the momentum. There's lots of M words we can come up with here, but it's like the momentum, that maintaining, all of those go with management, which is quite handy because they all begin with M. So, leadership mindset. So, the things I had down here was visionary focus, risk tolerance, and long term thinking. So, the visionary focus is more about the where are we going and why does it matter? And the risk tolerance is that leaders need to be able, we're back to the resilience element to it again, but need to encourage their team to explore, that sort of like, try new things. So whilst you've got the managers that will be putting the contingencies and making sure that risks are catered for, the leaders are going to be encouraging people to push the envelope, to try new things, to encourage innovation, etc., etc. What would happen if we tried this sketch? So that they have a much greater tolerance to making calculated risks and dealing with uncertainty. And then there is the longer term thinking, so that they are going to be thinking about change, as you've rightly pointed, the transformational change. Where do we want to be in 5 years? So that is very much, as you rightly chipped in with, that whole element about here's the plan, this is what we're doing to make sure that we're getting through the plan, but the leaders need to be there to be going, well, does the plan still fit the changing market, what's emerging, etc., etc. So those are the two mindsets. Those are the sort of like the questions or the actions that managers and leaders need to be in. And then I went on to the skill differences. So if we go back to management, I've said some of these already, but it is the planning and organising, it is the execution and monitoring, it's problem solving to make sure that efficiency doesn't get buggered, it's delegating, assigning tasks to people, and it's attention to details. They're the people that need to be in the data, they need to be in the budgets, they need to be in the fact that they've got enough resources, they need to be compliant, all of those sort of like elements that I think that we often think are the leader's job. They're not. They're the managers. That's not to say that interpersonal relationships and active listening and the managing up, there's all sorts of other things as well, but those are the key ones that I came up with in the first instance. And then from a leadership skills, I went strategic thinking, inspiration and motivation, adaptability, emotional intelligence, and influence and advocacy. And again, there's a whole load of other things there because they're managing through others. They've got to be really strong in their communication styles, because from a strategic thinking perspective, if you want a company to be able to keep holding on to where the long-term goal is, leaders need to be talking about it all the time.
Yeah.
And the managers need to be talking about, you've heard what the goal is, this is what we're doing this week, or this is what we're doing today. There's got to be that balance with that. So they've got to be quite persuasive. But what tends to happen, and again, I mustn't get too much into this because it's still sticking with the structure, is you don't want this ethereal, this is where we're going to be in 5 years' time, and everyone going, well, how the fuck are we getting there?
Yeah. So you need it's the map and the compass, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The how, the where and the how, or the where, the why, and the how are
exactly
all things that
all things to all people. And and I think the emotional intelligence bit comes out for me as well in the communication style. They've got to be able to read their audience. That's not just the manager's job, but they need to be getting the managers to trust them, and then having managers who can articulate what those things that they've been saying that make sense. But that leader has got to be about somebody who can talk to somebody at all levels. You don't want them in the ivory tower. You want them to be able to pitch things correctly. And then the other, just one more, and then I am going to shut up so that you can then start going whichever way you want, because you're so much more of a leader than you are a manager, clearly.
What do you mean?
Is about empowerment. It's such a throwaway word that gets used so often, but that influence and the communications and managing or leading with that element of empathy and etc., I do think that the leader's place is about really making empowerment a thing rather than just a word. And that's what I had to show some of the distinctions.
Nice one. And those are all really helpful to just start off with this discussion, because as I said, Seth Godin has got a great video about the differences, and he's very clear. He thinks that they are very, very, very different. And much as he's a very clever man, I don't know I necessarily always agree that it is quite so black and white. I think there are 2 points that sort of come out from some of the things that I've been looking at. And one of them is that often there seems to be this sort of idea that one is better than the other. You know, that leadership is great and managers are sort of, you know, annoying little sort of narrow-minded creatures. You know, you look at sort of how you know, things like The Office and Bad Bosses and lots of films and how this narrative that one is better than the other and one's more important than the other, which I think is obviously another fallacy, that, you know, you need both. Just having a leader without having people who can manage, it can be, you know, things don't work without managers. The managers are absolutely necessary, and they have a skill set, as you've outlined, that is just as important as the leadership. Also, there's this element of the cult of personality. I think this idea that leaders are somehow these hugely charismatic people, and it comes from this, again, this sort of concept of this masculine idea of leadership, that they are showing the way, follow me chaps, and you know, they're brave and courageous and all of these things. And I think it's much more nuanced now, that historically, you know, years ago, before we got into maybe more of a cult of personality and this concept that all leaders had to be hugely charismatic, managers were viewed as important and just as important, and leadership didn't really play a huge part until there was a need for change. Leaders manage change, whereas managers manage just the day to day, keeping going. And so I do think that there's this need to maybe just reframe that narrative, that we're not suggesting that leadership is the be all and end all, and is the only thing that's important in getting things done. And then the other one was this idea really that there's an awful lot of overlap and sometimes a misunderstanding, because I'm doing a diploma in leadership and change management, and find that people get very confused between leadership and management, particularly when lead is put in the title of actually what is a management role. And so someone's a team lead and everyone goes, well, you know, they're the leader. And he's like, I know, they're the manager. So actually we have to not look at the title, and we've did an episode on titles as well. You know, obviously that there can be a lot of leadership behavior in a management role required, because they're now, in the way that companies, that things are structured, are a lot flatter. And so therefore there is often a need for managers to also be able to demonstrate leadership skills, particularly the ones about empowerment and about emotional intelligence and about being able to listen and understand, because often they are the ones who are dealing with conflict at a sort of fairly low level. So yeah, those are just some observations that I'd had in terms of how we talk about it. But the way you've talked about leadership skills and leadership mindset and management skills and management mindset it's really helpful to be able to make that distinction, but then also to acknowledge that in many roles you may need elements of both sets of skills.
I'm trying to remember if it's in Simon Sinek's book Leaders Eat Last, or whether I've seen it somewhere else. I've got lots of things going on in my head now, so I'm going to try and keep with structure, which is probably going to go flying out the window in about 30 seconds. But there was something about the army or military, and it says something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing now, so forgive me, but when it's peacetime, or you know, you're back at the regiment or wherever it might be, there is a definite requirement for management. So it's and you'll remember this as much as I do, but the sort of like the inventory checks of all of your kit, and making sure that your resources, being it vehicles or people,
and training,
and then the training and everything else besides. So very much in that managerial skill set. And yet you put yourself into operations or conflict or pressure situations, and you need leaders at every level,
Yes.
because then that adaptability, that motivation, all of those skills that we talked about there come to the fore. So I believe that leadership can come at every level in an organisation, and I herald that and have been the purpose shouting for that at all levels, because you can see that potential and you actually wanting them working in that way, whatever their role, whatever their job title, because that's also what makes an organisation transform and change. You can't just do that from the top. So I absolutely agree with you on that. And I love that distinction, if it is in Simon's book or wherever I got
Yeah.
it from, about the, I think you said about the mundane, the day-to-day element to it. And when the stakes get raised, what are those situations where you then need something different at play, or the volume more up on? And I think the other thing from the overlap and the way that you've described it, but I think it was the question that I was in whilst I was actually looking at all of this, was when is the overlap real, or when is it orchestrated? And what I mean by that, when it gets orchestrated, is when do I sit in a situation where I really should be leading, and in fact I've got my sleeves rolled up and I've taken on management tasks, and I'm pretty sure I am not the only person who should be in that question. And equally, rather than that all being bad, when is it good to be having your sleeves rolled up but still exhibiting leadership behaviours? Because what is it about me going and washing vehicles all that time ago, or what is it when I'm alongside somebody, shadowing somebody, being taught how to do some data input, or whatever it is that I've actually done to build the different connections with people by doing and understanding, that I can then uproot and get back into a leadership, more of a leadership element to it. So I think that, where I was at with this is the pros and cons of actually having those overlaps, and when do we need to spot that we need to be much more of one than the other. And I don't know if you had any examples, because I suppose the reason I got into that was I started going, oh God, am I a leader or a manager? And can you be one without the other? And I suppose I'm left with that question as well, because of being in organisations where I've found myself stepping into gaps. I showed leadership skills when I was a manager. So that thing that I say about leadership skills can be at every level. And then I hit into what were perceived as leadership roles, and found myself in places, in particularly with hospitality, with my sleeves rolled up, because I was given the smallest team I'd ever had with the largest amount of people, and stuff just needed to get done.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's all of that. When does it make sense to be flipping between the two, and when do you need to be distinctly one more than the other?
And it's a really good question. And but one of the questions you asked was, which now I can't remember what it was, but it was along the lines of,
When is it real, or
can
when is it orchestrated?
well,
Really?
no, more it was
Oh,
more about, can you be one without also being the
yes.
other? And I think certainly I have, as you so kindly pointed out, my leadership elements are, I quite like to go off and like sort out problems and go off into where can we go with this, rather than the mundane is not my favorite thing. And so I'm very aware that as a leader, I have not necessarily at all times been the leader that I needed to be because of my lack of management capacity and skills. And so it is something that I have started to look at more carefully. And again, it does come down to this idea that somehow leadership's better than management in my head, and that it's more fun to be a leader than a manager.
Yeah.
Although not always. Often there's hard decisions to be made, and that's kind of hard on the psyche sometimes. But Yeah, I'm very aware that management is not my forte. And it also comes down maybe to I'm not really much of a completer finisher. If we start looking at Belbin and all of those, you know, that is not something that I naturally gravitate to. So I've become more and more aware of it, particularly when I've been in sort of program management, project management, and there's a hint in the title that you are a leader, but there's also a large amount of management that's needed to be done. And that's the bit that I have to really, really work hard at. So, and I don't know that I necessarily just think of it as just, you know, rolling your sleeves up, albeit that there is a big part of that. But it is that there's a whole load of other really great skills that I'm not really good at in terms of management, of actually managing time, delegating and checking things and making sure that you're on
Yeah.
the right track. So whereas my brain just goes off and follows a butterfly with my latest ideas. So I think that there really is this, as a leader, you have to have management skills as well. I think it's really hard to be a good leader without a big solid dose of management mindset and skills as well. And I think to be a good manager, I think it's really hard to be a good and decent manager without also having some elements of leadership particularly in terms of those interpersonal skills and th- so that's why I sort of sometimes struggle with this idea that you are either one or the other, but I completely accept that to be able to be successful at either, you have to know when to bring which elements to the fore and to prioritize. And sometimes that can be difficult because when you have to be a manager and the team needs management, if you go off on your little leadership flurry, then you're not doing the service to your team or the organization or the task
Yeah.
that's necessary.
I think that there is definitely an element of both, and if you don't have it, you have to learn it, because in exactly the same way, you know, you talk Belbin, I would talk Facet 5, and I've been doing some work with Facet 5 again recently, and so it's back there in my face about my control score. And my control score, when you look at Facet 5, it goes 1 to 10, and 1 is the end of creativity and adapting and just going with the flow of everything, and 10 is the battening down the hatches and the plans and the organisation and the detail. I'm at a 1.
Yeah, I think I
And
probably am too.
and
I'm gonna have to try this. I need
yeah,
to do this assessment.
exactly. I will need to do the assessment with you. But of course, my husband then goes, "That's ridiculous," because, you know, you're always worried about breaking rules. I'm not actually worried about. I might. Yeah, I probably am about worried about breaking rules, but I don't think that comes into this control element to it. But I think we've talked before about my Excel spreadsheets for Christmas.
Yep.
My Excel spreadsheets for our episodes, you know, all of that. That's learned, and that's the difference between what is your traits and what's your learned behaviour. So I know that I have learned behaviour. I've had to learn better management skills, and I've been in enough jobs to do that. It's not my favoured place to be. But the interesting thing is, when I think about it, is there's something very safe in creating a spreadsheet, dealing with the data, looking at the plan. So I sometimes do retreat to what I would consider to be a safe place. So I know that that's some of the reasons that I bowl back into getting my sleeves rolled up, because I feel it's safer. I'm also a person who likes the act of doing. Whilst I love being in leadership positions, and I love the thought of the change and how that's all going to look and everything else besides. One, it's a very lonely place some of the time.
Yes.
It's quite like, oh fuck, am I making the right decision, sort of like sketch.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't feel very safe. And there's nothing tangible some of the time for you to get your mitts around.
Yes.
You know, I get to the end of the day, this is when I was in these type of roles, and go, what have I actually done today? And I come home and I'd say to Ash, I've achieved absolutely nothing. He says, but who have you spoken to?
Have you thought about?
What have you thought about? You know, so I was really bad, and I probably still am not that great at it, to give myself thinking time, which is a leader that you actually need. Because that whole, oh, what am I meant to do now? I'd want to go and find somebody to talk to. So that's another element that I would flip down to that end. And then I also would flip down to that end because things don't ever happen quick enough for me. So that would be why I'd need to see the plan and be going, 2 weeks, why can't it be done in a week? So although I wasn't the planner, I always wanted to know why it wasn't going quick enough, because
Yeah.
there was also then that thing about, as the leader, I got to explain why it was going to take 6 months when I probably had a boss who wanted it done in 3.
Yeah.
So I think that there has got to be the two. But I guess what I'm trying to articulate is that I can see when leaders get drawn into the management element,
Yeah.
probably more than I see managers getting dragged into the leadership
Yeah. I
element,
think that's fair.
because I think those leadership skills that we're talking about that you want in managers as well have got to be in the managing up. So for me, that's
Mm.
got to be the influencing, the adaptability, the emotional intelligence to know how to pitch to your boss
Yeah.
when they're being bloody difficult, saying I want 1 week rather than 2,
Yeah.
whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Into that interchange between the two, I think is extraordinary. And I've been in too many organisations where I don't see enough of either, or one is out bowling the other, and what that then creates.
Yeah. I think that that's a really important point as well. And in terms of sort of organizational management, I think it is something that leaders particularly need to be very aware of. First of all, by not having this idea that somehow leadership's better than management to
Yeah.
start with, and to really value the skills that managers need and have. But then I guess in a way the leadership element is to this empowering piece that is so important within the leadership skill set is about empowering managers to grow their leadership skills in a way.
Yeah.
Because as you said, often this idea of leadership at every level, and often if you say to a manager, or often you say to people, hands up who is a leader, and people don't, won't do it. They go, well, no, I'm not, that's not my job. And you're like, we're not talking about what your job title is. Who's a leader? Who is a leader? And so many times I've talked to, when I've done women empowerment sessions, and you talk to women who are homemakers, and or, I'm only a mum,
Yeah.
and
The
I'm just
just
I'm
word.
just a
Yeah.
mummy, and I've never been a mum, but I am absolutely in awe of the leadership skills that are required and management skills that are required to be a mother, or to be a parent, or to be a homemaker.
To keep other people alive,
Yeah,
basically.
and to grow them into hopefully decent human beings that are going to, be able to survive in this big bad world. So yeah, I'm always amazed by the limited belief people have in their leadership skills, or their leadership capacity, or their leadership involvement, that so many people don't go, well, when I say, well, tell me what you do, and then they sort of say blah 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 blah. I say, well, that's leadership skill. There, you're dealing with conflict, you're managing change, you've got a goal, whether that's just getting little Jimmy to school, clothed and with some food, all of those things. It really amazes me. And so I do think that a big part, as you said, of leadership is empowering, but it's also empowering managers to be able to have the space to develop their leadership skills as they go along, because that can only be for the good of everybody. If there are managers who maybe have got nascent leadership skills, and also don't realize that they have the capacity or the space to be able to show those skills, that giving them the space to do that is really, really beneficial for everybody.
I agree, and I think that goes back to this business about the risk taking versus risk aversion. At first, is that I think from my leadership capacity, if I think about what people have said have been about Bobby getting me to do things I didn't even realise that I could do. It's like, I'm giving you this to do, and they'll be like, what the hell? And I'll go, well, I think you can do it, and I'm going to help you do it. Now, of course, you've got to be careful that you're in an organisation with leaders who are going to allow some level of risk taking
Yeah.
and maybe things not working out. And so, you know, where again, I guess my leadership skills have been that they're better, not best, you know, what's best, has been when I've had the ability to be going to a board and saying, look, this might not work. And if it doesn't, we'll stop doing it. But it clearly isn't working the way that you've always done it. So we've got to try something different.
Yeah.
And I'll come back and let you know if it's worked or not. And if it's working, then we'll do some more of it. And if it doesn't, we'll stop doing it. So I think that that's definitely one of the elements where you want to be empowering people to give things a go. That's definitely where I see that coming out. And I think the other one that I wanted to pick up on is this, you know, we use the word adaptability. Now, I have somehow got children who have survived my parenting whilst I worked full time.
Yeah.
And interesting, I'm going to be on another podcast very soon about this level of conscious parenting. I was unconscious most of the time with it. But when I think back on it now, in terms of what you have to adapt to be able to make all of that work, and you do see the skills coming out in other places. But I think one of the things that I wanted to sort of like add into that, and we've talked about this as well, is that this adaptability is about learning, unlearning, and relearning things. And the reason I just wanted to mention that is because I've got this other little segue that was going on in my head when I was looking at all of this. And again, I go back to the military with this, and you'll know this, where in our line of work, in the signals, we had technicians, and technicians got promoted quicker
Yeah.
than everybody else did
Yes.
because of their expertise. And please forgive me, any technicians out there who turned out to be the most amazing frigging leaders in the world, because I know you exist.
Yeah, they do exist.
They do exist. They do exist. We know the brilliant foremans that we actually had working for us and everything else besides. So they do learn their leadership skills. But it always left me with a question about experts going down one channel too quickly, and what that did of their skill set for adaptability. What did they know about management,
Yeah.
let alone what did they know about leadership? Now, they may well have the innate skills around leadership, but they're not all born. They have to be practiced, they have to be learned, just like anything else from the mindset perspective. But when people have built careers on being experts and specialists, and you find them promoted, and I see it all the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Loads of technocrats.
Yeah, find them promoted into roles. And I'm not blaming them, but it's the fabric of an organisation. If this is what you want to do, what are you doing to articulate what is now required of them?
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily them now needing to be a specialist anymore. You are asking them to be something entirely different.
Yeah. And that's a super important point for so many organizations, and particularly bureaucracies, where, you know, absolutely you need to give a sort of sense of gravitas to the technical expert. You fit them into a leadership role because they need to have that gravitas or that recognition as the importance of their knowledge. But if you're going to do that, there has to be a recognition that this person is in a leadership role without being promoted for their leadership capacity.
Yeah.
And therefore, you need to support them. And some places do. They kind of put technocrats into a technical role, and there's no leadership requirement from them. They just are super clever people who know a lot about whatever it is, and you go to them for that knowledge. And they don't have to be emotionally intelligent, they don't have to be able to do advocacy, they just have to provide information and ideas or whatever it is that is the role. But if you're going to put them into a leadership role, then you have to check that they've got some capacity and then support them and help them develop those skills, and be cognizant of the fact that until they have them, that really there has to be some support to them, either in the role of another person who has some leadership skills to advise them and mentor them, or put them into a role that doesn't require leadership if they absolutely don't have it and are struggling.
And I think that, you know, this is where we're back to the interconnectedness of people, because you do see them promoted onto potentially executive teams. Well, it may be a specialist, it may be HR, that's specialist, whether people like it or not. It may be finance, that might be seen as specialist. But I think the distinction for me as well, and I see this with teams I'm working with now, is that when you are in transition from department head, role specialist,
Yeah.
to leader, there's a massive transition there. And the support and help that's actually needed from those leadership teams is, how do you expand somebody from only ever thinking about finance,
Yes. Yeah.
or ever only thinking about HR? God help me. But do you know what I mean? Because I would like to say, yeah, but people are in everything. But does that always have me being properly in the conversation about, well, what's the commerciality? What's the pound sign? So the learning, that leadership, learning, unlearning, relearning at a senior management leadership level is the widening of your view, because it's not anymore just about the budget.
Yeah.
It's about, what are we doing with the money for the next 5 years? And what are all the things that we've got to consider in that? And equally, if you had like a technical specialist who had ended up on the leadership team, it is incumbent on the other leaders to be asking the questions about, well, from your technical expertise,
Yeah.
what are the trends? Where should we be looking? What are the new markets? So you could still then play on their technical skill, but bringing it in a different way. And then they have to bring that back to the party. And the transition bit for those, I think, the move from management to leadership, that's why I'm building my consultancy around that, because that transition is often tricky.
Yeah.
And it's not about leaving your managerial skills behind, or your learned behaviours, your learned mechanisms for some of us, including myself. But it's the, how do you take that, but don't keep veering back towards that. But what are you doing now? What is it that you're bringing to a much wider focus? It's back to the mindset piece and changing that mindset, not necessarily the skill set a lot of the time.
And that, I guess, is probably the most important thing for organizations to recognize, is this. And I think it really is often missed out, that people just assume, you're promoted, now you're leader, yay, well done.
Yeah.
And actually being able to recognize the additional things that need to happen, and also, as you've said, being able then to start to recognize when you need to be one more than the other, which is hard if you never experience being the other one to a huge extent. So I think maybe the big message for organizations to take away in terms of management leadership discussions is this: how do we help, support, understand, recognize what's happening when you move from one to the other?
And I think incumbent on the leadership team, but of course let's just bring the word management back in one more time, because it is about self-management.
Yes.
So an expert, a specialist, a department head needs to be supported in their own self-management about, what is the learning I now need? And I've had situations where the rest of a team can say, oh, well, so and so's now in the team, this was their role beforehand. They would do well to work with a coach to support them in what their self-management, what their learning journey now needs to look like to be able to step up into the senior role.
Yeah.
And the person goes, well, I haven't got time for all of that because I'm still working on the budget sheets. So they're not making the transition. And for some people, that has to be spelt out, that this shift has got to come. This isn't a, would you like to? This is a, you want to be up here and taking the bucks. There's some work to be done.
And on that note, madam,
yes,
do you have a quote?
Yeah, somewhere amidst my structured notes that I have made.
Sorry, before we move to a close, were there any other points that have come out of your structure and planning?
There are some books and films I'm going to put in the reference line. I'm not going to go into these all now, but there's some great books to show different bits and pieces. I've got, of course, the wonderful Master Cynic is on there, but Rosalind Torres, in terms of what it takes to be a great leader. She's very much about adapting leadership for the future, which is great. And then from the other side of things, Peter Drucker, the effective executive, which is about strategic management. So strategy, but in management and productivity. It's pretty cool. And then 3 films I came up with which show very different things. One was Moneyball, mainly because I love Brad Pitt. There's a great message in there because he brings a whole team together by using data and numbers, facts. That whole management focus about facts and what you can motivate as a result of that. So I want to put a little clip up of that because he's just glorious, and it really hammers it home about facts and figures and what you can do with that for some people. And then I love The King's Speech, from a vulnerable place of leadership, and Invictus with Morgan Freeman and what he can do around the whole leadership to actually inspire a whole nation through rugby. Of course, I had to get that in there as well. But a real mixture. And I just put all of those in the reference because I think if people just want to go and have a little bit of a think about leadership and management in the way that we have and what that brings to the fore, they're great places to start.
Perfect.
And finally, so my quote, I couldn't find one which actually brought the two of them together, but I'm left with John Cotter, who says about leaders, they don't make the plans, they don't solve the problems, they don't even organise people. What leaders really do is prepare organisations for change and help them cope as they struggle through it.
Nice one. So it does recognise that there's management going on as well.
Absolutely.
With all of those things that leaders aren't doing.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Bobby.
Endeth the lesson.
Yay. All right then. Well, see you next week.
See you next week. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. All the resources mentioned can be found on our Spotify page to find out more on this week's topic. Next week, be ready for some chat about women in history. Yes, we will be very specifically talking about female leaders in recognition of International Women's Day. Come and have a listen to see if their leadership skills are the same, different, or so what was needed at the time. Join us for Being a Woman in History.